Rei Ayanami has hands down the most contentious fandom in all of Evangelion. In fact, despite her overwhelming popularity in Japan and considerable popularity in the West, the obsession EVA fans have of her has been considered a symptom of ingrained cultural misogyny and emotional regression. According to Schizo Evangelion's editor, which is an anthology comprising of several Ganiax employee interviews and essays written about the series, Oizumi Mitsunari said the following: Rei is a sacrifice offered to all the Japanese mama's boys and sadists. And to further parallel this claim about Rei having an appeal to those with arrested emotional development, series creator Hideaki Anno claimed that Rei's popularity with Japanese youth was a result of a stunted imagination originating from Japan's defeat in World War II, stating, "Since that time, the education we received is not one that creates adults." In other words, Hideaki Anno and Oizumi Mitsunari find that Rei's appeal as a character is misguided and embraced for the wrong reasons. In essence, you're not supposed to like Rei. Now, as someone who finds Rei to be their favorite character, I was clearly confused by these attitudes, so I went down the rabbit hole of Rei Ayanami's history and biography in order to see if the elements of her character that I enjoyed the most were the ones that were being criticized by both critics and developers of her character. What I learned, however, was that indeed, you're not supposed to like Rei, at least not in the way that her popularity would suggest, because her acclaim has been largely due to a set of characteristics that are degrading and show a dark collective consciousness among Japanese millennials and weebs abroad. Hello Funkers, Tony Funk here, and today we're going to explore the disturbing reality behind Rei Ayanami's popularity, and then despite that, we're going to defend her, not because of the attributes that made her popular in the first place, but because beneath the surface, she is the most fascinating and uniquely written character in Evangelion, and perhaps all of anime. So welcome Funkers to my defense of Rei Ayanami. Rei Ayanami was originally conceived as the personification of Hideaki Anno's unconscious mind. Perhaps as a result of the ineffability of such a concept, Rei was quickly neglected in the writer's room, often having an amorphous intent within the greater scope of the Neon Genesis Evangelion narrative. Rei was also spitballed as being Shinji's unconscious mind, but was not cemented as having a fixed character profile, with Hideaki Anno admitting that he did not know what to do with Rei's character halfway through the series, him claiming that he did not know where life was taking his staff. This means then that Rei was a stand-in character to represent something, perhaps personally meaningful to Anno or to his staff, and her character development was continuously pushed to the back burners during the series' production. The result of this was a character whose presence was limited and mysterious amongst a cast of characters whose psyches were heavily explored and developed. This is not to say that Rei Ayanami had no character development whatsoever, but that due to her neglect, her story incidentally concluded in the 6th episode of the series. Though this was not intentional, her character's development was truncated for the rest of the series. Episode 6 marks the end of her journey as a character when her schizoid-like personality is challenged by Shinji's encouragement to show emotions. You see, up until the 6th episode, Rei was seen as a loner without social awareness nor a desire to connect to her peers. This behavior created an aura of mystery around her, exacerbated by her limited appearances and lines. The biggest mystery regarding her, however, was built up around her seemingly positive relationship with Gendo. This early on in the series, there was anticipated revelations regarding the nature of her relationship with Gendo, and why she seemed to act differently towards him than with anyone else. Consequently, everything we needed to know about her relationship with Gendo, as well as why she seemed to have schizoid personality disorder, was revealed in a single scene. As we all know, Rei had conflated Gendo's concern about her own utility to his goals with sympathy towards her situation when she was rescued from the entry plug after Unit 0 went berserk. This was shown when Shinji rescues her from the entry plug in the exact same manner Gendo had, and Rei sees a flash of Gendo's face as she begins to realize that Shinji cares about her well-being, unlike Gendo. But not only did this scene reveal the mystery behind her one-sided relationship with Gendo, but it also presented her change as a person when she stated that she did not know how to react to catharsis. Shinji, encouraging her to smile and her doing so, completed her story arc right then and there. She learns to become human from that point forward, and we view Rei in a completely different light until the series concludes. This consequence of not planning her character properly doomed her to remain static after that turning point, and to make matters worse, the instances when her character aligned with her new personality were far and few between, due to Hideaki Anno's lack of interest to further develop her. Don't take it from me though, according to Hideaki Anno, and I quote, at the end of the 6th episode when Rei says, "I don't know what kind of expression I should have at a time like this," and Shinji says, "I think you should smile," and Rei smiles, when I thought about it afterwards, I cursed. I thought, in short, that if she has already communicated with Shinji there, then isn't she over with? At that moment, Rei for me was finished, all at once. So now we can see how from Hideaki Anno's perspective, Rei wasn't interesting for the majority of the series because her personal narrative was squandered early on. This attitude towards Rei persisted throughout the rest of production, and later in his life is evidenced by interviews where he expressed little interest in Rei's characterization. It then came as a surprise to Anno to see that Rei became Eva's most popular character despite her having the least amount of development. One instance that helped Anno understand Rei's popularity in the eyes of the Japanese public was after a set of Rei figurines and bandages sold out in record time ahead of every other merch item. Fujie magazine put it plainly stating, "Arguably it is because of Anno's dictates on design that few Evangelion toys were initially made, but figures of Rei in all her bandaged beauty sold like wildfire. This is probably the first and only example of an animated mecha series where the reproductions of human characters outsold those of the robots. It must have been telling then that in a mecha anime with giant robots, destructive angels, and a relatable protagonist, the most coveted merch item was a briefly featured, neglected, emotionally stunted 14-year-old in bandages." As Evangelion matured as a series in the 90s zeitgeist, an anime trope known as moe exploded, often attributed by Rei Ayanami's depictions as naive, inexperienced, and chronically injured. To this day, many anime rely on vapid characters that use their moe appeal to garner popularity and viewership. Nowadays, we all know how effective moe is in fomenting giant audiences and lucrative merch sales, but ultimately the question is, why? What's the appeal? Moe enthusiasts claim that the biggest appeal of moe is the fact that characters represent purity and a need of protection. Their cuteness is alluring because it fulfills a fantasy of preserving the innocence of childlike wonder. Think of it as a desire to be a good big brother for a defenseless little sister. Though there is nothing wrong with wanting to protect innocence, since it is the duty of the powerful to protect the weak, I found that similar to other forms of escapism, such as in the way that true crime documentaries overwhelmingly appeal to women. Moe appeals to a fantasy, that is to say, an allure to moe does not equate to activism for the innocent, but rather the formation of parasocial relationships with the moe characters. What does this mean though? It means that people want to feel like they're in relationships with moe characters. And though this is literally normal when we watch films or shows, often with us identifying with the protagonists and wanting to be their friends, what's disturbing about this is how moe characters either intentionally or unintentionally, as is the case with Rei Ayanami, are on the submissive end of power dynamics. Parasocial relationships with moe characters, then, mean that the viewer has complete control over the moe characters in their mind. In essence, then, moe characters satisfy the fantasy of being in complete control of someone naive by being the more experienced party. Fans of moe essentially wish they could have relationships with people as depicted in these animes, which is harmless until you realize that in real life, wanting to have a big brother-like relationship with an unrelated young naive girl is creepy and would raise some eyebrows. I'm going to let everyone read between the lines here, as I trust you all understand what kind of fantasies I'm hinting at, because after all, most moe characters are children, as is in the case with Rei. But it's not just the fact that Rei elicited moe fantasies that made her so popular, but also because her personality is basically the personification of the Japanese ideal woman, referred to as Yamato Nadeshiko. This term, literally meaning caressable child, refers to a woman that ascribes to the culture of domesticity, viewing domestic, virtuous, kind, gentle, and honest women as wife material. Not only is this creepy because Rei is 14 years old, but it also paints a picture of how many Japanese otakus relate to female characters as hypothetical wives. Jeez, no wonder the Japanese don't f***. Now let's look back at what Hideaki Anno said about Japan's obsession with Rei again. When referring to what he thought caused Japanese otakus to gravitate towards Rei, he alluded to post-World War II culture and education, stating, "Since that time the education we received is not one that creates adults." What connections does post-World War II education have with an allure towards moe? When we look at Japan in the lead up to World War II, we find a highly militaristic and imperialist society, similar to the industrialized European nations during the height of colonialism. Among the many mantras in public discourse, hard work and a collective superiority were the most important. This collective consciousness created a predatory engine that brutally conquered Manchuria and devastated its population. Masculinity was linked with honor and sacrifice and was ingrained in every citizen of Imperial Japan. Though toxic, this belief held the nation together under the guise of stability up until Japan's unconditional surrender to the United States. When an idea so pervasive and ingrained was suddenly removed, a vacuum occurred in the collective consciousness and new ideas quickly took their place. After Japan's surrender, its entire identity of isolationism was finally lifted, and the empire was subsequently emasculated. This emasculation was interpreted as the idea that Japan was no longer mighty, and since then became the second fiddle to the West and the United States. This cultural and economic domination was ultimately what led to the creation of anime as we know it today, and it became a form of escapism from Japan's tumultuous past and from accepting its own domination at the hands of the West. Japan's fate did not change as it was backstabbed by the West during the 1985 Plaza Accord that caused a pricing bubble in the 90s. Japan's economy plummeted due to the artificial depreciation of the US dollar against foreign assets, and the era of Japan's inferiority complex reignited. According to Nihon Keizai Shimbun, a Japanese financial publication, when Rei Ayanami first appeared, the self-esteem of the Japanese population was at an all-time low, as the economic bubble had just burst. The empathy towards Ayanami, a wounded girl who climbs into an artificial humanoid and silently fights her enemies, is rooted in that particular era. A figure is a modern idol that embodies unconscious faiths. Although the economy recovered, maybe Japanese people still have a hollow in their heart. If Rei's defenseless nature and parallels to Japan's declining cultural prominence are what made her so popular, does that mean she's just a bad character? Not at all. Though she may exhibit these traits, she's got more depth beneath the surface, and it's the subtleties of her character that really make her shine. Interestingly, I think it's precisely because of her forgotten nature by Hideaki Anno that she became an unreplicable character by demonstrating maturity and achieving her objectives without being overtly performative, unlike Asuka or Shinji, who were given more development. Rei's redemption from being an object of power fantasies to being the most interesting character in all of anime starts after episode 6. Once we've already realized that she isn't a schizoid or void of personality, but rather a victim of psychological abuse, we can see how she deals with her lot in life with grace and unwavering resolve worthy of admiration. You see, Rei is not only mentally strong and mature for her age, but she's actually the series' most emotionally intelligent character. Out of all of the children and adults in EVA, Rei exhibits the most maturity and resolve. In episode 11, during Nerve's power outage, Rei demonstrates that though she follows her every order to a T, it does not mean she is devoid of agency, and in fact exudes leadership skills in leading herself, Shinji, and Asuka to the EVA launch area. When confronted by Asuka about being Gendo's favorite, she ignores her until Asuka gets in front of her. Then she simply dismisses her claims and says, "I don't act superior and I'm not treated better either. I know that quite well." This means that by ignoring Asuka's jabs until she physically blocks her path, she's purposely avoiding unnecessary tension between them, meaning that her social awareness is significantly more developed than previously believed. The way she handles Asuka by not engaging her demonstrates an understanding of stoicism, for only focusing on what's important during an angel attack. Rei, in doing so, demonstrates an ability to delegate actions in an order of importance during a time of crisis, all while trying to avoid emotional conflict. In episode 12, we get a glimpse of Rei's personality when we see that she's uninterested in attending Misato's steak dinner, stating that she doesn't like meat, possibly alluding to her nature as part Lilith, mother of all living creatures, or maybe because, as we stated earlier, she initially was supposed to represent Anno's unconscious mind, with Anno being a vegetarian. Regardless, this isn't everything we learned about her personality in episode 12, as she shows genuine concern for saving everyone's lives when she asks Misato to explain the grounds by which she inferred Sahakiel's trajectory. It's interesting then that the quietest and most reserved pilot out of the three was showing the most concern for humanity's survival. In episode 14, we get the most introspective look at Rei's psyche. Here we see her true feelings regarding her sense of self, Gendo, and her understanding of human existence. Upon testing her compatibility with Unit 1, we get a monologue that details her thoughts as she begins to contact Yui's soul within the entry plug. She begins the monologue by detailing the world in which she lives in, as a metaphor for who she is as a person, and I quote, "Mountain, heavy are the mountains, but that changes over time. Sky, blue sky, what your eyes can't see, what your eyes can see. Sun, there is only one. Water, comforting. Commander Ikari?" In the first part of Rei's description, she refers to mountains, which are exaggerated reliefs of the earth, yet she ensures to describe their transience. Even though the ground is comforting, as it represents stability and something firm to keep us from falling, Rei thinks of mountains as something that is in a constant state of change. Her reference to changing mountains, then, alludes to the transience of her own existence, and the fact that stability is only temporary. Then she refers to the sky as something that can be seen by the eyes, but also cannot. The sky being an ineffable concept that can be perceived as a blanket of blue or orange, but not really seen in its pure form, alludes to Rei's sense of self that can be perceived as her body, but also cannot due to her self-awareness being intangible. When she refers to the sun, which can only be one, she refers to the soul, which transcends the body, and similar to Rei being at her second iteration, ultimately, it still carries the same soul. Then she talks about the comfort of water, a fluid with no predetermined shape. Rei finds water comforting because it has no defined boundaries unlike solids. There is no separation between waters as there is no way to determine when one unit of water ends and one begins. This amorphous nature is comforting because it symbolizes a lack of division in between individuals, something akin to human instrumentality and LCL. When she thinks about the comfort of water, Commander Ikari comes to mind as she questions whether or not she finds him comforting. At the end of her monologue though, it becomes apparent that she does not find him comforting as she lists him last in a list of her colleagues organized by her fondness of them. This part of her monologue, however, acts as Rei's credo for how she views herself. She sees herself as a being awaiting her own death in the same way mountains wither away with time, but also as a being with a sense of self that cannot be categorized nor separated from who she is. Her allusions to the sun refer to the uniqueness of her soul, yet her attraction to water refers to the disillusion of her ego. Basically, Rei initially sees herself at odds with her own desire to die and to connect to others by having as little ego as possible. This means that her perceived quietness and shyness stems from her desire to be loved and to connect, in contrast to Asuka's ego, which ultimately creates a barrier between her and everyone else. Rei also expresses her disapproval of being used as a vessel for Lilith's soul in this monologue. When she references many flowers and states how many of them are alike and how many are useless, she states that her many versions are useless as they are mere copies of the original. Though at this point in the story, Rei is probably not aware of her future role in instrumentality, she shows disapproval of her own replaceability and lack of originality as being one of a series of identical beings. This disapproval regarding her own unfortunate existence is the reason why Rei suffers from Thanatos, also known as the death drive. Therefore, she finds her existence as a burden, stating during instrumentality in episode 25, "I want to die. What I want is despair. I want to return to nothingness, but I can't. I can't return to nothingness. He won't let me go back. He won't let me go. Not yet. I came into existence because he needs me, but it's over now. I won't be needed anymore. I'll be abandoned by him. I had always longed for that day, but now I'm afraid." Basically, Rei wants to fulfill her duties initially out of a misplaced fondness for Gendo, mistaking his attention for genuine care. But because to her, living as a replaceable drone gave her no meaning, she had longed to return to the nothingness she felt before her creation. When she is dismayed that Gendo won't let her go back, she experiences buyer's remorse from helping him achieve instrumentality, thus dooming her to exist for eternity as a part of a collective consciousness. This is what to me makes Rei so fascinating. Rei has the mental awareness to realize that her existence is predetermined, but because she thinks by helping Gendo she is contributing to the greater good, she doesn't sabotage everyone like Shinji had done whenever his tantrums would cause him to quit being a pilot, but rather she sets her own wishes aside to die in order to help humanity first. Sure, her desire to die causes her to selflessly act as the punching bag whenever Shinji needed her protection, but she ultimately continues her duties to help others, and all without seeking any validation for her sacrifices. We also see that aside from wanting to die, she also has a deep bond with the world, recognizing that even though existence is not her cup of tea, her bond to everyone else is what keeps her piloting her EVA and tolerating being treated like a sacrificial lamb by Nerve and Gendo. This is evidenced by her conversation with Shinji in episode 6, where she states that the reason she pilots her EVA is because of her bond with the world. This bond then causes her to consider lowering her guard and having as little ego as possible so that she may connect to others easily. The problem is that Rei was never able to form connections until she met Shinji because of both the horrific lifestyle she was subordinated to have under Gendo and Nerve, but also because everyone else in Nerve had serious psychological issues, making them incapable or uninterested in connecting with Rei. Even though Rei was far more aware about her condition than she seemed to be on the surface, she made no attempts to connect to anyone because she had never been shown love in the first place, and never had the opportunity to learn to make friends. This is why she initially had an emotional attachment to Gendo for so long, despite him never caring about her well-being. Later in the series, when Shinji cleans her room and she says thank you for the very first time, she contemplates how she had never stated words of gratitude, as if realizing that she had never made a realistic attempt to connect to anyone. Once Rei feels loved, however, her character questions her own Thanatos and ultimately fears death. In episode 23, Rei starts crying and expresses shock over her own emotional response to achieving the goal she had longed for. Before self-destructing in order to save Shinji, Rei feels sadness that she can no longer connect to Shinji, which tells us that the only emotion that could trump her own disgust with herself was love. As a consequence of Rei's narrative neglect, she became significantly more interesting than the likes of Shinji, Asuka, or Misato by representing a character who silently suffers, but braves the reality of their existence proficiently without seeking anything in return. This is why Rei is the most unique character in Evangelion, and even anime in general. Her strength is immense, but is showcased not by her actions, but by everything she doesn't do. Hideaki Anno's Rebuild series, then, decided to build on the subtleties of her character from the original series in order to relieve the more profound elements of who she was. This is why in the Rebuild series, Rei takes a more active role in trying to connect to Shinji, and why Miss Lookalike in Thrice Upon a Time begins to learn to live as a human, despite her original demeanor being even more rigidly detached than her original depictions. Essentially, once Hideaki Anno accidentally created Rei as a consequence of neglect, he realized the character was special and needed to be represented in its entirety. The end result was a mysterious character that was not as naive nor as emotionless as she seemed on the surface, but one simply acting out of love, an unrequited love, mind you, for a world that saw her as expendable. Despite this, she continued to work selflessly to save the world before she would get her wish and return to nothingness. This is the brilliant tragedy of Rei Ayanami. So, though Rei's overwhelming popularity stems from the fetishization of her perceived weaknesses as a quiet and defenseless damsel, this interpretation of her character couldn't be any farther from the truth. Rei is not only a badass heroine who saves humanity multiple times, but she is a paradigm of strength and selfless character for the greater good. Rei isn't anyone's moe waifu. Instead, Rei is the Giga Chad personification of strength and unwavering resolve.